Morning and welcome to the Core Connection. I'm Mira Rubin here with you on Enlightened World Network. And today's topic is edges. Edges are points of transitional magic, really, where one thing becomes another, where there is a synergy, a dynamism that we get to explore. So it should be a really interesting conversation. But before we get started, let's take a minute or two to get present. So let's take a deep breath in through your nose and hold it. And imagine clean, crisp oxygen flooding into your lungs, flowing into your bloodstream, nourishing all your cells, all your organs, bringing vital life energy to your body and being. And as you exhale any tension, stress, negativity, fatigue. And now let's take another deep breath in through your nose and hold it. This time, imagine brilliant, bright light lighting you up from the inside out, illuminating, electrifying, energizing all your cells, all your molecules, all your electrons, and creating a brilliant beam of light from your heart out into the world. And as you exhale any remaining tension, stress, negativity, fatigue. And now let's just gently press our palms together and just very softly rub your fingers against your palms. Feel the deliciousness of that sensation and allow yourselves to become present right here, right now, in these marvelous physical forms that enable us to experience the miracle of life. Welcome, welcome, welcome. So good to be with you this morning, as it is every weekday morning. And it's a Friday already. That's amazing how quickly time passes. Just keeps feeling like it's accelerating. Anyway, today's conversation is about edges. And edges are a place of potency. Good morning, Tori. Welcome. So good to have you here with us. Haven't seen you here for a while. I think you've been here before, but if so, it's been a while. I'm delighted that you're here, and delighted that everybody else who's joining us is here to participate in this conversation. So today we're talking about edges. And, we talk about living on the edge. We talk about edginess. But the thing about edges that is so extraordinary is that they are points of transition, points of union or connection, transition, transformation, all these things. There's an incredible dynamism happening on edges. And particularly where I'd like to focus our conversation today, at least initially, is in the importance of edges that I notice in the work that I do, the core connection work that I've developed. When people have Oh, Tori says, your video popped up when I needed wise words. Wow, that's a blessing. And thank you for that compliment. So hopefully this idea of edges or this conversation about edges will be what you need this morning. So in the core connection work that I do, there's a visualization sort of piece of the work where people are talking about what pops up into their minds when we're in the course of a session. And sometimes people will say, okay, well, something like there's this big black box. And so my question will be, what do you notice about that black box? What do you notice about what it's surrounded by? What do you notice about where the edges of the box meet that environment? Or if they're talking about a fog, what do you notice about the edges of where the colors meet? Good morning, Bernadette. Breathe. I love it. Om. It's beautiful. Yes. So was I getting really too excited? I'm not sure. Anyway, when we talk about these edges, these are transition points. And we can often notice the edges. And by noticing the edges, notice what is happening, where there is shift and change and transition and transformation. And we can even look at this in the context of emotion, where sometimes we might feel, this is an extreme example, but we might feel like we're being pushed to the limit. Well, that's an edge, right? And what is at that edge is, there's kind of a phase shift possibility. We talked about this yesterday about quantum healing and jumping to new dimensions of consciousness. And with this notion of edges, what we can see. Oh, thank you, Bernadette. Bernadette says, love the energy, and was just sharing in the moment. Thank you, I appreciate that. So when we notice the edges and our edges, and edges of things in the world. I mean, even if you look at a thing and put your attention on the edge of it, then there's this transition. There's a transition field, maybe we can say, that there's this transition field, and that transition field carries all kinds of energy in it. So Bernadette says the edge of the closet needs to be purged to make room for simplicity. I love it, Bernadette. And Tori says, my husband came in the room and asked how much is a private reading. So I don't do readings, I do sessions. And these are transformational sessions. That's what the core connection work is. It's really transformational technology to clear not always long held, but deeply held patterns that are impacting our lives. If you want to check out my website, Tori, to find out more, go to yourcoreconnection.com. You can see the URL up top there, and you'll learn more about the work. It's very profound, deep, deeply transformational work. But this whole conversation about edges is like there's a lot of energy at the edges, because there's either a transformation of perception or there's transformation of state. So I'm just looking at this bottle that has purple liquid in it, and there's light, the lights that I use here is behind that. So there's this really brilliant or bright white light around this purple bottle. And as I look at the edge, there's all kinds of activity, even in my eyes, where the perception is shifting, where there's like a bright light, and then there around it, and there's shadow, and it almost feels like there's a field that is emanating from this thing as I'm looking at it. And I think that we can recognize the material fact of that, and also recognize that as a metaphor. So when we are feeling edgy, even, we can tune into what's going on, what's happening, what's the dynamic in that emotion, in that sensation, in that feeling. And Bernadette says everything is energy. Indeed, it is. Exactly. And I appreciate you speaking that. That is exactly the case. And what I'm saying is that edges have a higher intensity of energy. And the reason, maybe in my hypothesis, again, not fact, but my hypothesis is that there is in one way a completion of one thing and the starting of another, except that most edges are not, maybe not any edges are sharply defined. I mean, with lots of physical objects, it looks like the edges are sharply defined until we really start concentrating on the edge and noticing, well, wait a second, there's something going on there. Like as I'm looking at the edge of my monitor, you know, the edge becomes less crisp and less clear. And what we're looking at with edges is transition points. So it's almost like there's a repository of possibility and energy in the edge that is concentrated and amplified because there are two edges, at least two edges that are connecting, and in that connection there's vibration and there's maybe bleed through and there's an interchange, and in that interchange is all kinds of energy potential. I know I am not schooled yet in the intricacies of permaculture, but I do know that permaculture looks at the edges. And I learned that after I was very aware that I look at edges in the core connection work that I do. And when we do look at edges, what I notice occurs for people is that those edges shift. That those edges are kind of, as I said, a repository for change and possibility. So when we focus on those edges, things emerge that we might not have otherwise predicted. So Bernadette says, what energy does it release? The jar you just spoke of, I bet it feels a calm and beauty. So here's what it is. It's called Top Purple, and it's like a cleaning solution for glass and jewelry and whatever. So, but it's purple, as you can see. Actually it's looking really dark on my screen, but it's actually this beautiful purple. When the light comes through it, you can see it, you can feel that clarity of energy because it's coming through the plastic. But what I'm noticing is all the gradations around the edges in my perception. I'm seeing white around the edge, I'm seeing gray, I'm seeing black. And it's the way that our perception, our eyes interpret visual stimulus, right? Which is all energy, right? Energy patterns. So when we recognize the edges, we are shifting, if at the very, very, very least, what we're doing is we're shifting our focus of perception, right? I don't know if I read this part of what you wrote, Bernadette. So if I already read it, it's funny, short-term memory, I don't know. But Bernadette said, the jar you just spoke of, I bet it feels a calm and beauty. It is quite beautiful. I love, love, love purple. So that feels especially good to me. And for me, when I get engaged by beauty, what arises in me is awe and wonder. And that's kind of like my personal salvation formula, is connect to beauty, and that connects me to the wider universe. But and we can look at the edges of that, right? The edges of experience. When people talk about living on the edge, what are they doing? They're challenging their preconceptions. Is at least that's my interpretation. Living on the edge is living in the realm of discovery and exploration. And when we observe edges, first of all, we're tuning our observation, which oftentimes we don't do at all. So we have a heightened awareness that we might not otherwise have. And then secondly, we with that tuned awareness, notice something different. When we focus on the edge rather than the object, can you recognize that the shift of perception is hugely profound? When we focus on the object, we're identifying the object, if that makes sense. We're looking at the thing. So it's a bottle, for example, and it's filled with purple liquid. When I look at the edge, what there is curiosity and an unknowingness and a sense of discovery, because it's no longer the thing, if that makes any sense. So Bernadette says it's kind of like when the edges of a burnt field, the new growth still emerges through the crispness. I love that, Bernadette. Oh my gosh, what a vivid and brilliant image. I love that. So what we can see is this transition point, like a gradient of new life coming through the burnt ground, particularly on the edges, or where the edge of the field, where the burn stopped, and you notice that some parts are burned and some parts aren't, or some parts are partially burned, and there's this maybe that's exactly what you're talking about, Bernadette. I realized that as I was trying to describe it. So this whole idea of edges is transitions from one state of being to another state of being, whether it's one object to another object, whether it's one emotion to another emotion, whether it's light and color transitioning to different light and color. So what is happening at the edge is really, really interesting. And to go back to these sessions that I do with folks, sometimes the edges are sharp and crisp. Sometimes the edges are fuzzy and mutable. Sometimes the edges are rounded and smooth. Sometimes they're rough and ill-defined. So the thing that I love this burnt field idea, Bernadette, because we have a polarity there that makes it all that much more vivid, where we have part of a field that's rich in growth and part of the field that's been burnt, and the place where those parts meet, there's a blending, there's a we can say a communion of sorts, a connection, an interchange, a dynamic. And so when we explore edges, for instance, I told you I really don't have a strong foundation yet in permaculture ideology, but when we think about the way that these edges translate to real life, we can look at where like within a city, where a gentrified area meets a poverty-ridden area. And there are transition points. I mean, if anybody's who's ever lived in a city, you know that there are transition blocks, where there's a mixture. And in that place of possibility, in that mixture, there is possibility for new things to emerge that may create a lesser extreme between the things that are meeting in that edge. Bernadette says it's kind of like when I'm sorry, Bernadette says exactly. So yes, so with a city, if you can imagine using the burnt field metaphor or analogy, then we can see in a city where there's a have area and a have not area, and where they start to interface, often those edges are not utilized. They're not, the word that came to mind is exploited, but I don't mean it in a bad way. What I mean is the opportunity that's available there is not often utilized, is not often nurtured. Because it's really funny to hear language, right? Because I was thinking, is not capitalized on, like these sort of patriarchal establishment kind of male oriented in terms of, traditional thoughts of male versus female ideas were coming to mind, and to deliberately hear that and to recalibrate and shift the language to maybe the more divine feminine kind of idea of nurturing. So in these edges, we have the opportunity to be nurturing possibility, so in those edges where a wealthier community is meeting a less endowed community or a less wealthy community, there's interface, there's opportunity to create bridges, there's opportunity to create new possibility that we often do not make use of, that we do not, there's that word exploit, right, from kind of more conventional verbiage, but we don't maximize, we don't nurture that possibility. So Bernadette says you have to look at the edges to see the crispness and allow the time of growth to blossom. You can't take the middle and work out. You always need to go from the outside edges inward. And that's a beautiful, beautiful observation, Bernadette, is to, we talk about the fringes, right? Working from the fringes and from the outside in. I think we get to do both. I think we get to work from the inside out and the outside in, and hopefully it meets somewhere, hopefully those boundaries. Bernadette says the edges are actually a boundary. Well, the thing is that when we start looking at the edges become less absolute, I think. Like where we look more and more closely, like if we looked under a microscope or a magnifying glass, the edges might be not, or might not be quite as vivid and defined. So Bernadette says, or a bridge between past and future growth. I love that too. Why not look at it in time? When we look at our past, when does our past end and our present begin? When does our past end or our present end and our future begin? If you want to be looking at timelines, it all gets quite fuzzy when we start thinking of the actual edge. and what we can recognize is that in many cases, edges or boundaries are arbitrary. If we look at voting districts, right? The determination is somewhat arbitrary. Actually, not with gerrymandering, it's kind of deliberate, but there is an arbitrariness about things like voting districts, where one side of the street ends up or state boundaries, one side of the street is one state, one side of the street is another. Yeah, I think there's 5 points where 5 states all meet and you can stand in the middle and it's like, well, where are you? So I think that when we look at the edges, there is a possibility, like we're in between. It's kind of like being between dimensions, if we allow for that. And when we're in between, when we're on that actual edge of in between this and that, what resides there is incredible possibility, right? Which most often is overlooked. But if we put our attention there, there is an opportunity for unbounded creativity and possibility for things that might not otherwise have been made possible, or even might not have ever come to awareness. And so edges are a way, are a vehicle into insights about transition points, about what is actually happening. Where is the transition occurring? Is transition occurring? What does it look like? And so I encourage you to check out edges and entertain this idea of what kinds of openings edges can provide in our material existence, in our emotional existence, in our relationships. We talk about give and take in relationships. Well, what are the edges? We have boundaries in relationships. What do we notice about the edges? If we have established boundaries, we talk about establishing firm boundaries, particularly for protection when we've been wounded emotionally or physically. We're going to set up boundaries. And when we look at the edges, we get a clearer sense of the nature of those boundaries, and also perhaps have the opportunity to recognize other options for interaction or behavior or reaction or interpretation. And we're all about consciousness here, right? So edges give us a foil to be able to explore our awareness in kind of a new way. I don't know if there's anything more to say about that this morning, but I hope that you'll take this thought into your day and look at it. One of the ways that you can look for edges, and it just occurred to me, is to be listening to a sound, maybe a bell or a bowl, or just listen to the sound and follow that sound until you can't hear it anymore. And the thing is that before you get to the point where you can't hear it anymore, there will be a point that you're not sure if you're hearing it or you're not hearing it. And in that moment of hearing and not hearing, there's an expansiveness if we can presence ourselves to it. There's an expansiveness in being in the space between black and white. You know, it's kind of like being in the nothing and everything. And that is the place of potential and possibility. And that is the transition point that we're really talking about with edges. And then allow yourself to open to whatever that possibility might be that hadn't previously made itself visible or present to you. So Bernadette knows it's time to wrap up. You have a happy and wonderful day and a wonderful weekend to everybody. I just want to say thank you, thank you, thank you for engaging in these conversations, these morning musings. I'm Mira Rubin. This is the Core Connection, and I go live each weekday morning here on the Enlightened World Network Facebook page at 9 a.m. Eastern. I really encourage you to check out the other wonderful programming on the Facebook pages for Enlightened World Network, EWN One with the Earth, EWN Enlightened Living. And it's a wonderful community. I'm so grateful to have this opportunity to share with you, and so grateful for your support, your presence, and your love. And so much love to you. Have a wonderful weekend.